Alright, so today we're going to get into some more Immanuel Kant, and this video is going to be harder, but at the same time it's going to make the last video easier. It's going to clarify a few things in the last video, and we'll keep moving forward like that. But after the first few times that I've taken Kant, I remember telling my teacher that when you teach Kant, it's a really good modern philosophy class, and this is what we're going to talk about today. When you take a modern philosophy class, you will pretty much run into three major philosophers of the modern period, and those three philosophers are: the first one is René Descartes, the second one is David Hume, and then the third one is Immanuel Kant. So René Descartes is going to have his own style of philosophy, and then David Hume is going to have his own style of philosophy, and then Kant's style is going to be like a mashup of those two together, right? So the first one, René Descartes, his idea was called rationalism, and rationalism is very mind dependent, right? The mind is everything. And René Descartes, he starts off the modern period of philosophy as he was doing his meditations. He was in a room and there was a fire in that room, and he's writing about this. And he's writing about his experience, I guess you could say. But what he writes about that is he starts to doubt things, right? And he's doubting his own reality. And in a way, he kind of like wipes out his experience, or maybe not his experience, but he wipes out what he thought was reality. Okay, and he ends up saying that where he's at is he's in a dream where nothing is real. Okay. And he's in a state of doubt, right? So he goes and finds things that he knows of that is perhaps true. Okay. He says, what I do know, even though this is a dream, you could say that I have a thought, right? He's saying that he has a thought. And if he knows he has a thought, then he himself must exist, right? So there goes the idea, or, he writes out the Latin term, I think therefore I am, right? It has the word cogito in it, right? Your consciousness. He says, I think therefore I am. And we're going to put that to the side for a second, okay? And we're going to talk about David Hume. David Hume, on the other hand, his style of thinking was, you can call it skepticism or empiricism, right? And David Hume's philosophy, you could say that he was skeptical of things, right? Because the way it was set up was that he was very dependent of the world, right? As opposed to René Descartes, which is, he's saying he's dependent on the mind. David Hume says everything is dependent on the world, and our experience is dependent on the world. And the way I kind of like draw out David Hume is to say, in one of his books, he says that there is a missing shade of blue, but yet you know that 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 shade of blue exists, all right? And the reason why you would know that that shade exists is because you've seen a chart of blue with that shade. Otherwise, you would not know. So if you've seen it already, and then you had a chart with it missing, then you would know that that shade is missing, right? And let's just kind of put that to the side, okay? Or put it somewhere. He also says that we, when we're experiencing the world is giving us these impressions, that we can think of things as long as we've experienced it first, right? So our experience and our, like, you could say, like, our imagination is based on our past experience, right? Just take, for example, can we imagine a unicorn? Or do unicorns exist? He says, do these things exist, right? Does a unicorn exist? And when we look at a unicorn, when we think of it, if a unicorn exists or not, what we're doing is taking our past experiences and kind of like putting them all together, right? I've seen a horse before, right? I've seen a white horse before. I've seen all the colors of the rainbow, right? And I put that on the horse's hair, and I put the body as white. And I've seen a horn before, and I'll put it onto the horse, right? And then, voila, I got a unicorn, right? But this unicorn is based on all past experiences. Okay. So a little bit more about David Hume, and then we'll kind of compare those two, okay? So with David Hume, right, he has some type of skepticism. And the way I'm going to talk about the skepticism is to say that and I'm going to use causality to talk about his skepticism, right? Because David Hume bases all his stuff on the world giving us impressions. He draws correlations of causality after the facts, right? We could look at event 1 happens, and then event 2 happens, right? But we're going to say that that's not enough for us to draw a correlation, because it's just random. But if it happens again, we see that event 1 happens and then event 2 happens, and it leads to the same thing. We could say that in correlation, that these events led up to this event, right? But with David Hume, he does not know if that event is going to happen. The next time, right? And you could say that he's seen these two events, one after the other, happen numerable times, right? But there's still that idea that, you know, that he doesn't know what's going to happen next. You could say, do we know the sun's going to come up? David Hume's going to say he doesn't know with certainty that the sun's going to come up tomorrow, even though he's seen it every single day of his life, right? It is skeptical, and it's based on the past. All right, so I'm going to run through René DesCarte and David Hume again, and we're going to look at different facets of these two. René DesCarte, when he was doing his meditations, he actually said, in between all that, he says that God has given him the thought, right? So he says that God is a higher being. And so there are higher beings and there are lower beings, right? And God, this God giving him this thought, was an all-giving God, right? And this God was an all-knowing God. But DesCarte is not an all-knowing person, right? Because the all-knower would not need to learn anything, right? Because it's always, God is always given, and DesCarte is learning something, right? He is of a lower degree than God, and he's receiving something from God. He's receiving a thought, right? But then René Descartes would say that, he would say that he'd have a higher degree of reality than other things. Like if he was giving things to something, giving knowledge to someone or whoever or something that he was giving, and the thing lower was able to take it, right? So with this setup, you could say the more you know, the closer you are to God, right? Or you could say the less you need from God is the more closer you are from God. And the more you need from God, the further you are away from God with this setup. In a way, he has some type of hierarchy. And now, René Descartes has what you call a degree of reality, right? And he is mind dependent, right? In a way. And David Hume is world dependent, right? But David Hume cannot tell you anything outside of his past experience. He cannot create anything new, right? Whereas René Descartes can, right? It's two different things. And Kant, when he looks at these two, he kind of puts these two in a single category. And he's going to call this category Transcendental Realist. And the reason why he calls these two Transcendental Realists is because these two philosophers are talking about A, either the mind, or B, either the world, right? But what we see is they are kind of mirroring each other. So Transcendental Realism is like mirroring, okay? And I'm going to explain a little bit more. Whatever René Descartes says, I think therefore I am. If he says that he's a unicorn, if he really thinks he is a unicorn, then he is a unicorn, right? But then we could kind of look at David Hume and René Descartes and be like, you're not a unicorn. But in his mind, all that matters to him is that he's a unicorn because he thinks that way, right? And you don't have to stop there, right? At being a unicorn, you could think that he is God or whatever. He could think of anything, right? Now, David Hume, on the other hand, he could experience himself as a unicorn, and it would be just the world becoming a unicorn, right? The way after he puts it together, all of a sudden he's a unicorn. Or to even clear that up, we're going to say that David Hume had nothing to do with the initial creativity of being a unicorn. David Hume and his philosophical setup, the world allowed him to be able to put together the unicorn. It was allowed to. He was allowed to. So the differences between Descartes thinking he's a unicorn as compared to David Hume thinking he's a unicorn or putting a unicorn together are two different processes. All right, so now, if we were to kind of put these two together into something that works, the way we'd kind of look at it or do it is to say that we'd let David Hume be able to create something beyond his past experiences, right? And we would look at René DesCarte and perhaps give him some type of limits to work with this degree of reality, right? Because him saying he's a unicorn, when we see it, it's kind of unbelievable in our a priori disposition, right? But if he were to say he was a human with our a priori disposition looking at him, it would have more validity, right? We'd give René Descartes more validity if he had some limitations. And again, David Hume, if we were to take away some of his limitations of only being based on past experiences, he'd be able to have some sort of creative aspect beyond past experiences. And we're looking at this, right? We're looking at these two. René Descartes, when he says that I think therefore I am, and he could think whatever, he really has no limitations, right? And when we see René Descartes with no limitations, we're just kind of looking like everything is mind dependent, but it says nothing about the world, right? It doesn't say anything about the world. That is to say, with Descartes, when we think that we're looking at the world, in all actuality, we're just looking at Descartes' mind and not the world. The world is just actually the mind, right? He's saying pretty much that the mind creates the world that we live in, right? And so the relationship between the mind and the world is like a mirror, where the mind, what's with the mind, is the world, right? The mind will tell you everything, the world tells you nothing, right? David Hume is kind of like the opposite. He says the world's going to tell you everything, right? And it's going to tell you about your mind, and what's in your mind is actually just the world, right? So we're looking at the mind and the world, and they're two independent things, right? And this is what Kant was saying, that these two are transcendental realists, right? Because the mind, there's the mind or the world, and they mirror one another, and it does not work with each other, right? It doesn't work with each other. One doesn't have limitations, and the other one's completely limited when limited to the experience. So Kant is going to say he's going to create something that has the mind interacting with the world, okay? And that mind interacting with the world is transcendental idealism rather than transcendental realism. Okay, so that's all I want to talk about when it comes to all the intro stuff. And we're going to get back into just straight Immanuel Kant. And if you remember what I was talking about last video, the most thing that I focused on from watching the last video is that part where I said we kind of do a deduction, right? And we're going to talk about that. And we're going to, but now that we've kind of gotten an idea of Transcendental Realism, we're going to try to have the mind and the world kind of work together, right? And I'm going to say the mind is the a priori and the world is a posterior, okay? And I was talking about the a priori as something that is spatial, right? And it tells us about the future and the past. When we see something in our immediate area, we could kind of see where it could go and where it's been, right? And I want to say that the a priori is qualitative. And the a priori is qualitative depending on your skill set or your mental tool set, right? It's going to give you different degrees of something, right? Okay, so we're going to say that this mental tool set that we have with the a priori is going to work with the a posterior, right? And we're just going to say this a priori skill set has degrees of understanding, right? And again, the a priori has no words, but when we take the idea of understanding, you know, in the German sense, we're going to say a grip, right, is the word griff, right? And the a priori is going to grip the a posterior moments, right? And we're going to call it moments because we are limited, you know, of our experience of the a posteriori because our experience are of limitations. So the world, strictly talking about a posterior, is disparate, right? It's broken into a multiplicity, and it's simply there, right? And it has to do with our individual experiences, right? But it's quantitative. It's simply there. It's quantitative, and it's not qualitative. Like how the a priori can hold on to these disparate things, right? And not only can it hold on to these disparate things, it holds on in different degrees, right? It could hold many of these things, right? And it could perhaps not know them all that well, or it could hold two things and know it pretty well. And to remember why, it's because we have a predispositioned tool set that we use with our understanding or our experience to process, right? So now here we're gonna talk about if we were able to eliminate our limitations from the a priori, right? And the way we're gonna look at it is as a process. And in this process, the moment I tell you, right, that we're gonna take away our limitations from the APRI, we kind of have to, not that we have to, but one way of processing it is to say that we were holding on to a thought, right? A disparate thought. And we held everything there and we eliminated just perhaps our physical cells, right? Me, you could replace me with air, right? Or you could put a tree there or a black hole or something. But I, in the process, was taking out something in the equation while holding the rest of it there, right? So now let's just say I eliminate my own experience, okay? Me eliminating my own experience still gives me the rest of everything else, right? So here, when we talk about the APRI, I'm going to say our experience, when we hold something, when we hold disparate things and we eliminate something, we say that the experience is irrefutable. And because when we took away an experience, the experience that we took away is a refutable experience, and that is a posteriori, right? But what is left in the a priori experience is something that's irrefutable. But we could take away the whole experience of something that's disparate with the a priori, and that would be refutable. So, one more time, when we hold on to disparate things, right, we're doing an activity, right, and to add to that activity, we subtract something. And when we subtract something, we are left, because we're holding it there, we're left with everything else, right? And that's pretty much what I meant by deduction. And when I say that that experience is irrefutable, you will always be left with some type of a priori disposition, right? As opposed to the a posteriori being something quantitative, right? It has a characteristic that it is in a completed state, right? Where it doesn't need mental tools to exist. I want to focus on the moment I ask you to do a deduction, right? Your mind is going to go through some process, and I'm not going to know what that process is. What I'm saying, though, because your mind, I'm going to say, is a disparate thing that's kind of independent of my mind, right? So in Transcendental Realism, our minds are disparate, but in Transcendental Idealism, our minds are kind of connected in the a priori, via the a priori, and the a priori is something that is indifferent between us, and the disparate things or of multiplicity. And as I go through this process, I can knock off one thing after another as my mental tool allows me to be left with more and more inscription through this deduction. And that is as if, say, that when we eliminate these experiences, there is more inscription. That is to say, if all things were equal in terms of our mental tools, it would be like that. But with the a priori, some things are more valuable when it comes to understanding than others, depending on your predetermined mental skill set. So what I'm saying about the a priori is the a priori is not disparate, and you could say it's singular, right? And it deals with these disparate things. Now, the last thing I want to say in this video is the a priori is taking disparate things and it's putting things in a sequence, right? It's trying to make sense of these disparate things. When we look at these experiences and these experiences putting things in sequences, we got to remember that the a priori is spatial, right? And it's going to tell us about the things in its immediate space. We could say where it's capable of going and where it's been, right? But depending on the skill set, there are certain experiences are greater than other experiences. So one last time, the a priori is dealing with degrees of reality and something qualitative as opposed to the a posteriori is quantitative. And that is something we kind of got to keep in mind. And next time we're going to talk about Kant's a priori synthetic, and that's also going to be a tough one. But when we talk about that, it's going to clear up stuff in this video. Okay? Thank y'all for watching.